Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tideway's autumn webinar, when we're looking forward to discussing the impact of the UK budget and the US elections. My name's Seymour Banks, and to provide the analysis and the insight, I have to say I'm delighted to be joined by the founder of Tideway, James Baxter, many of you I'm sure will know, but also Ben Klein, one of our senior wealth managers. First of all, I'd like to say in advance, thank you also for the number of questions we have received. It makes a huge difference to make this as interactive an experience as possible. But nevertheless, if you want to add additional questions during the webinar, there's a Q&A button on your screen, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In terms of the way that we hope to run the agenda, the first half will be focusing on the UK budget and what the implications are, particularly for financial advice. And the second half of the evening, we'll try and focus on the implications for investment strategy, both as a result of the UK budget, but also the US elections. And as I said, finally, before we do start, for compliance purposes, I should say that all the views expressed here tonight are personal. They are subject to change, and they do not constitute financial advice. So with that introduction out of the way, without more ado, kick off with respect to the UK budget. Beforehand, question for you, Ben, actually. We'd obviously received a lot of scaremongering. There were a lot of doomsayers about. Can you give us a brief summary of what actually happened and your view if that was actually the case or not?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Well, in the 20-odd years I've been doing this job, I've never had a budget like it in terms of the potential changes that could have happened. So James has been around a little bit longer. Maybe he's experienced it before.
No,
but
I definitely got everybody interested. That's for sure. Yeah.
And actually, in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount changed. Clearly, the big headline is about pensions and them being part of the estate for inheritance tax purposes. But actually, of all the rumours that happened, there wasn't a huge amount that changed. So what didn't change? Well, first of all, lots of things around pensions. The amount of tax-free cash that you can take from your pension, that remains completely unchanged. So that's good news. Any reintroduction of a lifetime allowance, that didn't happen. There's no change to the annual allowance of pensions, which is also great news. And the tax relief on contributions, that didn't change. There was a lot of talk about having a flat rate of tax relief on contributions, maybe 20 or 30%, but that's not the case. That remains the same. For inheritance tax, clearly pensions are the big issue there, which we'll discuss. But actually, in terms of being able to gift money, that hasn't changed, either lump sum gifting or gifting out of income. That all remains completely unchanged. And the allowances and the thresholds and the tax rates, they'll remain unchanged. Not all great news, of course. So these allowances are frozen until 2030, but still, it could have been a lot worse. And talking about being a lot worse, capital gains tax, that is another area that was a lot of fear within clients or the general public of capital gains tax rates increasing significantly and increasing to match income tax rates. And that clearly didn't happen. There was a small increase. So for basic rate taxpayers, it went from 10% to 18%, and for higher rate taxpayers from 20 to 24%. But really, that wasn't a huge issue. And the allowances remain the same, and also the ability to carry forward losses remains the same. So again, a lot of talk, a lot of speculation, but not a huge amount of change for capital gains tax. And very quickly, dividend taxes didn't change, the allowances didn't change, which is great news. ISAs, that didn't change. Again, a lot of talk about either the contribution amount of 20,000 a year or having a cap on how much you can have in an ISA. That didn't change as well. Again, great news. Income tax, no changes to rates or thresholds or allowances. Again, not all great news, but not disastrous news either. So in essence, a lot of talk, a lot of rumour, but actually not a huge amount of change. But clearly, we'll talk about the pension inheritance tax, but beyond that, there wasn't a huge amount.
But it was a big tax-raising budget. I mean, obviously, I guess the main load fell on businesses, and as far as national insurance contributions, employers' national contributions. Not surprisingly, given what you've just said, the focus of clients' questions that we've received so far on inheritance tax and the impact of pensions being included within the estate. So I will run over a few of those, and then, as I said, we'll endeavour to answer any further questions that we receive on screen during the webinar. Ben, a couple for you, and then I'll hand over a couple more for you, James. So try and share the load. From 2027, if I died, would my whole pension be passed on to my wife, tax-free? And would she then be able to gift half of it to my kids?
Yes, a very important point here. So there's no inheritance tax between spouses, and that remains the case. But just a very quick recap. I know we're going to be pushed for time. A very quick recap of what the current pension rules are in terms of the death benefits. These new rules, won't come into effect until April 27. So again, a very important point here. We've got a couple of years to worry about this, to think about it, and to plan around it. So it's not a case of having any knee-jerk decisions here. At the moment, as things stand, if you were to pass away before 75, any beneficiary receives your pension completely and utterly tax-free. If you were to pass away after 75, the beneficiary receives it less income tax at their rates that they pay. The big change that's going to happen in April 27 is that it's become part of the estate, but not to the spouse, but to the next generation, so to speak.
So on that point about could you then pass on money to the children, so that, as my understanding is, that you have this 2-year window after death that you can make a decision if there's a situation where the spouse ends up with more money than they need in the pension pot. Yes, you could pass directly pension benefits onto the next generation. The issue will be from 2027 that whereas that would have happened without inheritance tax, now we're going to have to consider inheritance tax. So if the amount of money that you wanted to pass on to the next generation was more than 325,000, then there would be an inheritance tax to pay on that amount passed on to the children. So I think the big point for us will be the nomination forms that we've lodged with the pension companies. We know some of our clients have said, 50% and then X% to the children. We need to review those and see whether they're going to still be tax efficient, after 2027. But we've got a bit of time, as Ben says, to do it, and hopefully we'll get some help from AJ Bell to point out to us which of the people that applies to.
Yeah, essentially, it's an action point of checking the beneficiaries.
Yeah,
which we'll go through.
And in respect of gross roll-up, we've got a question here. Once inheritance tax has been charged on a SIP, will a beneficiary be able to leave net in the SIP wrapper? So will they continue to enjoy the benefits of a gross roll-up?
So I think that's still a choice, right? So
you don't have to take it out of the pension. You can
at the time of death, there is a choice to the beneficiary. Do they take it as pension fund, or do they pay the income tax and take it as cash?
And that's this big issue post 75, post April 27 is this double taxation.
We're quite,
income tax.
But the pre and post 75 to me seems completely archaic. It was there because you used to have this rule whereby you used to have to buy your annuity at 75, so fully crystallize your pensions. We haven't had that for a long time, so it's disappointing really that they didn't take the opportunity to simplify the rules. But hey, that's generally what happens. They just get more complicated. So we've still got to deal with this pre and post 75, and now we've got to deal with inheritance tax on top of the pre and post 75 issue.
We talk about different clients that we've got, though, James, and we've got a question here in terms of what are the IT planning implications? Obviously, that depends on the nature of the client.
Yeah, so I think there's generally 3 broad types of individual. We've got some clients who are always probably going to spend their pension over the rest of their lifetime, and these changes aren't really going to affect them much at all because there was no plan there to leave anything. And I think we've got quite a lot of clients for whom they've probably got enough money in their pension fund that they weren't planning to spend it all, and they're expecting to leave either the original capital or a portion of the capital to the next generation after the second death. Those types of clients we are going to have to, assuming that all these rules stay in place and through another government, we'll have to look at that plan and probably advance payments out of the pension scheme and make gifts so that we exhaust the pensions before they die. And then we've got a third category of clients for whom they're fortunate enough not to actually look like they might ever need the pension, who are just doing nothing with it to allow it to roll up for future generations. Those we're going to have some tough conversations with along the line, but we've got no massive rush to do that because most of them are in their 60s. So, with a bit of luck, they're not going to go anywhere for another 10 years. and we may get some changes going forward. I know there was one question about, did we think these rules might stick or will they change? My personal view is that we've gone from a very generous position with pensions to one which is probably overly aggressive and also looks really horrible to administer. Ben, I think you've been thinking about this a bit, and you know, it may well be that there will be a need to review these rules simply because they're just not practical. I mean, the idea that these pension administrators are going to have to go out to whoever's administrating the estate, work out what their inheritance tax is. You know, we're expecting AJ Bell to start charging for that. We know when we deal with a lot of insurance companies who aren't properly tooled up, have already got rid of all their staff. They can't even administer tax-free lump sums, let alone complex death benefits. So I think it's going to cause a lot of admin issues.
And so the issue now regarding
delays, yeah.
So previously we talked about pension consolidation being an important issue, certainly in terms of managing one's investment strategy and understanding one's approach effective from an asset allocation perspective. What you're saying now is, if we don't consolidate pensions, the administrative implications are serious.
Yes, I mean, if it broadly sticks and becomes, you know, a mainstream position that we stick with inheritance tax on pensions, then I think we're going to want to try and plan to have exhausted our accounts before we die, and so, you know, we maybe stop thinking about pensions as a intergenerational account wrapper, if you like, but think about them more as a sort of long-term savings program where we're going to draw on them from, let's say, age 60 to 80, so a 20-year period or a 15-year period, but we're not going to allow the account to roll on beyond that because of the complications that might bring with it. And
you always say that inheritance tax actually is a discretionary tax in effect, whilst you know, there's people complaining that by including the pensions within your estate, that has a serious impact, providing the planning is done in advance, far enough in advance. It remains that, bearing in mind that the fact what Ben said regarding no changes in terms of gifting, in terms of handing out surplus income.
It's got more difficult, Ben.
Yeah, I think you just, maybe it's a different priority in terms of where you draw your retirement income from now, perhaps.
Yes.
If you do have the luxury of other accounts or cash, ordinarily we're broadly advising to leave the pension to drawing the pension. Perhaps you want to bring that forward and start drawing from the pension, and even increasing the income that you take from your pension and potentially gifting that money straight through. When you gift out of that of income, that's immediately outside of your estate. So let's say rather than taking £50,000 a year, I know there's a luxury position here, but you could take £100,000 a year if you've got the luxury of other accounts, and then gifting that money straight through.
Yeah, we did some maths earlier today. We were talking about this, and we worked out that if you drew 100,000 out of your pension account for a few years, assuming you haven't got any other income, so if you did it before 67, for example, before your state pension kicks in, your marginal tax rate on that 100,000 was about 27%. So, okay, so we can't, you know, just not pay any tax and roll the account onto the next generation tax-free. But if we're careful and clever, we should be able to pay no more than a sort of marginal rate of 27% in order to bring these accounts down before the risk of dying is too high, if that makes sense.
So we've got a question here. Is it likely my kids will have to pay 40% inheritance tax on my remaining pension pot plus income tax at their marginal rate? Answer appears to be yes, but then likely
if we die after 75.
Subject to your point regarding dying after 75. Likely, of course, presupposes we've seen changes in pension legislation before. We've seen another change now. A new government could change things again. So
absolutely. Someone like myself, who's in my early 40s, my pension planning hasn't changed significantly. And it's important to note as well. So making contributions is still worthwhile, and planning for your retirement is still worthwhile.
Lucky you, Ben.
I'm sure the pension rules would change 4 or 5 times between now and I take my benefits.
I have definitely thought about my pensions differently because I'm of an age where I can see the end in sight. So you know, I do think it is it's probably an age 50 plus issue that we now, you know, we are going to have to think about them a little bit differently, and both in terms of certainly, you know, the attractions of contributing to them above, say, let's say 1.1 million is getting a lot less. You know, you're going to be, maybe you're getting 40% relief coming in, but maybe you're going to end up paying more than 40% coming out. We still get the gross, you know, the benefit of gross roll up, and that is, you know, that's still extremely beneficial. And indeed, you know, there's still the option to pay the inheritance tax and then pass them on to the next generation or the generation under them, for them to enjoy, you know, tax-free roll up for another 20 years. So, you know, we'll need to look at each individual circumstances, you know,
In this case,
to work out what's the best thing to do.
But linked to that, is it likely? An interesting question here has come up. Given that SIPs are effectively trusts,
Yes.
can these IHT implications actually stick?
Well, funnily enough, I called one of our clients who's an ex-retired lawyer, and they were debating the exact same thing on budget day around the coffee table. But yeah, I mean, it's a bit weird. Let's be clear. So, you know, this is it's not your money. So that's why we've always assumed they're outside of the estate for inheritance tax. But as it's been written up, and as the budget looks, and they published a consultation paper on the same day as the budget with some examples, worked examples, then it was very clear that yes, you pay 40% inheritance tax, and then if your beneficiaries are 40% taxpayers, you're ending up with a tax bill of 60 or 65% or something like that. So it is tax on tax if you just don't do anything and walk into it. So it definitely requires planning.
Very good. I mean, a simple question just to clarify the issue of inheritance tax thresholds with respect to family, home and other assets. Is it 1 million? Can it be 1 million? It can be if you've got spouses.
Yeah, with the combined allowances plus the main resident nil rate band as well, it goes up to
so it's 325 each, so that becomes 650, but then you get another 175 each, so it goes up to 1 million,
assuming your estate isn't more than 2 million.
Well done, Seymour. Yeah, not that you're an advisor, but you're obviously learning.
Not financial.
So you know, going back to your question, is it discretionary still? So if you can engineer, let's say you're going to die in your early 90s, if you could engineer that in your late 80s you were living in a house with no more than £1 million of equity in it, and perhaps living off the state pension and equity release at that point, which is very tax efficient, then indeed you could comfortably go to the grave and not pay any inheritance tax. Going to be more difficult to organise, but it's still possible.
Very good. There's been a lot of talk in the press as a result of these changes that we might see an increase in annuities being purchased. I know this is another of your favourite subjects.
Yeah.
Without going on for too long.
No. So I'm
give your view on
all
that,
I'm going to do is highlight that I am going to write a paper. I've nearly finished a paper about why I'm never going to buy an annuity. You'll be pleased to know. And why I think most people's instincts to avoid annuities are absolutely right. I won't go into the full detail of it, but I think, you know, broadly speaking, they don't offer us good value for money. There is a high risk that you don't get any return out of annuity if you die before your early 80s. They're very inflexible, and I think we can do a lot better in terms of getting value for money out of our pension funds by using drawdown, perhaps in a lower risk way than we've done historically. Maybe we take a bit less of our equity risk in pensions as we get older, so that we can draw them out in a more stable market environment. But generally speaking, I think we're always still going to do better with drawdown than we are with annuities. So I've only seen annuity providers and annuity brokers saying that annuities are going to be more in demand. I'm not convinced that's going to be the case. And I think most people's natural instincts to stay clear of them is probably right.
And also the rules may change as we talk.
And the rules may change.
5 years, 10 years time, it may change.
Labour governments aren't forever.
Hopefully. Got another question coming up on screen. For the annual ISA, would you therefore suggest using a SIP to draw cash up to 25% tax-free level and reinvest into an ISA or a cash, a securities ISA or a cash ISA?
Broadly speaking, yeah, I wouldn't veer away from the cash ISA personally, but certainly taking out the tax-free cash, depending on the value of the pension, and reinvesting it, absolutely.
I think, look, what this budget has done is really help us all think about who we're investing the money for, what is our time horizon for the investments? What's the best wrapper to have different investments in? And certainly, you know, if you're going to strip out your pension fund by 80, let's say, which I think is going to be quite a sensible target to aim to do, and you're in your mid to late 60s, you know, you've got a less, you know, a 15-year time horizon. So that's probably okay for equities, but it's better to have longer than that. So maybe the equities are better in your children's ISAs than they are in your pension account. So that's the way to think about these things, is to,
from a family perspective,
is to try and, you know, our misses on intergeneral things will be about education and collaboration within families. If the family's prepared to collaborate, then there's probably a much better place for you to have your S&P 500 index tracker than in your pension fund. I think it'll be in somebody else's account within the family.
And we've got a direct question, James,
yes,
on that, which is, you know, we've got a 1.6 million DC pot. Lucky man.
I think I
57.
had a look the other day, and I think we've got over 100 accounts that are over £1 million,
right.
And most of those accounts now have had their tax-free lump sum.
And having already taken the full tax-free, I'd been previously planning to contribute, obviously up to a further 60,000 a year. But I'm now thinking that would be a false economy to build a larger pension, given it would be so heavily taxed. It may be better just to fill the kids' ISAs. I think.
Or your own ISAs.
I think that's exactly the kind of person who we will need to talk to. It is quite a big change, you know, and I do think that we probably went from a scenario where the tax treatment was too generous to one where maybe it's a little bit over aggressive, but maybe even a future government might leave it somewhere in the middle. I don't know what you think, Ben, but and so I think the general perception that we're using these pension accounts as intergenerational tools has probably been knocked on the head. And, you know, against that backdrop, I wouldn't be funding over the lifetime allowance, or what was the lifetime allowance. And I would be thinking about, how do I get this money out and into the hands of the next generation efficiently? And we talked about,
or just different accounts,
or
in using retirement.
Yeah, exactly. But we were talking about taking it out and then paying pension contributions on behalf of the kids.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Exactly.
Because you pay the tax relief, you pay the tax to get the money out, and then you get the tax back when you contribute it. So things like that are going to work out really well, I think.
Yeah, especially if they're not being able to use up the 60,000 allowance.
Correct.
Annually. I've already given quite large ISAs and property, so don't want to invest personally. Right. Okay.
Give money to children.
So gifting is a good
and
way
obviously,
of forward,
I mean, the one thing about the pensions is that we know it's income, right? So Ben talked about the fact that you can make gifts out of income without having to wait for the 7-year clock. So I think it's going to be pretty difficult for anybody to say, if a gift has come out of a pension account, that it's not out of income, because you know, you can't have it both ways, right? So making gifts out of the income that we take out of our pensions is going to be an immediate outside of the estate for our IHT. So you know, that's why it'll still work when we're in our 70s and 80s, because we probably won't have to, you know, we're not having to judge the 7-year clock to make sure that there's 7 years there to get it out. It'll be out immediately.
This is a hopeful question, I think, but nevertheless, it'd be interesting to get your views. As the budget proposals to include pension funds within a pensions estate for IHT are out of consultation, for consultation, I should say, do you believe that the effective double taxation element, i.e. 67% tax for a higher rate tax beneficiary in drawdown, may be reviewed? Is that
sadly not? I don't think. I think the point of the consultation is to work through the admin around this, and as you said earlier, in terms of the pension schemes liaising with the executors and how they actually practically pay this. And it will be the pension funds paying the IHT, causing those huge delays and increasing costs. That's the point of the consultation, as far as I'm aware, as opposed to when it go ahead.
Yeah, I think Ben's got it. I think the issue might be that when they discuss with the pension providers the practicalities of doing of this charge as it currently stands, that it may just be too expensive, too time consuming, too difficult to levy, and therefore a simpler solution may be to come up with a flat rate of tax. It was, you know, for those of you who can remember, it originally started off as a 55% death tax rate on unused pension accounts. Then we went, you know, completely the other way to say there's no IHT and it's, you know, you can pass your accounts on. You know, maybe there's some sort of halfway house that we get to, but either way, I think we're not in, you know, we're going to be in a situation where we're not ideally we're trying to use these accounts before we die rather than pass them on. Couples obviously being the last death, not the first death. Yeah.
Just a interesting callback to the issue of annuity versus pension pot. I guess one of the benefits of annuity is that you can remove funds from your estate if that's a way of reducing your inheritance tax bill.
Yes, but giving the money away is going to work just as well. So as long as we get the timing right of when to do it, I think I don't think I mean the money's gone, right? So
I'd rather give it to family than the tax.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got £1 million in your pension fund and buy an annuity, all you've got is income. You've got nothing to pass on. At least if you get the maths wrong and you don't draw it out, you've got some money to pass on. So I think I'm 2/3 of the way through my piece on it, and I will publish it as quickly as I can, but I can't see a good reason to buy an annuity yet.
Final question from me, James, just to deal with issue of offshore bonds. And we talked about the fact that not much has changed actually in the budget. This is another savings vehicle where there were no changes. We've got a few clients who use offshore bonds. What are the main benefits for our clients from that perspective?
Yeah, well, the big thing is the gross roll up, and we're used to getting that in our pension funds. Obviously, we're now seeing a limit on the amount of money we can have in our pension funds. The next best thing, if you like, if you can't get the money into ISAs or pensions, is to use an offshore bond, and that's really the attraction of it, is to get the deferral of tax. It's pretty uncontroversial. It's not an aggressive tax planning vehicle, but they do give you that gross roll up, which is any kind of investment horizon over a decade becomes very valuable.
And it's easy to split up as well in terms of gifting out to beneficiaries.
Yeah, and it can be quite effective for inheritance tax planning. It's relatively complicated and times a little bit short, but there's an option of making that efficient.
I think we're just about halfway. Oh, hold on a second. Sorry, apologies. There's another question just come in. I believe the new leader of the Conservatives today announced at Prime Minister's Questions, not many people were listening to that they would reverse the proposed IHT for farmers. This is a question of reliefs around agricultural business relief. Property. Might this be extended to double taxation on inherited DC pots, in your opinion? I think.
Well, an old chum of mine, actually, Mel Stride, who was a client of mine, he isn't any longer, but I know him reasonably well. He's now the Deputy Chancellor, and he is the MP for Bournemouth. It's a very rural area, so I think he'll have farmers' interests at heart. So yes, I suspect that if he got into power, he would probably do something about that. I think we've already said what we think on the pensions, really. Yeah,
a lot's can change over a long period of time. So I wouldn't be surprised if it does get changed in some ways, but not back to the
one thing is
tax-free environment. Yeah,
the one thing we know is that, as has just happened, governments can't stop themselves fiddling around with these rules. In many ways, it's good that there's so many things, as Ben highlighted at the start, the left unchanged, and that stable environment for planning really helps us. It's horrible planning when there's too much change going on. So let's hope that we get some consistency over time.
Right. Okay. So yes, I said we're halfway through. I said that the second half of the webinar, we'd be looking at the impact for investment strategy, both of the UK budget, but also the US elections. So obviously the US elections tend to drown out the UK budget, but let's start with the UK budget just for starters, and the impact on markets, but also our strategy as a result.
Yes, so I think as far as equity markets, it's kind of largely irrelevant because of our, we have such a small exposure to the UK market now that we're not too concerned about the impact for equities in the UK. It doesn't look hugely pro-growth from what we're seeing and what we're hearing commentators say. But the bigger impact was around the amount of potential borrowing that the government are planning. It was the biggest tax rise, the biggest planned budget spend of all time. And that did move the gilt markets a little bit on the day. So what we have seen since then, and it hasn't reversed, was a rise in the gilt yields almost across the board. So even the very short-dated 2-year, 3-year, 4-year gilts have all ticked up a little bit, which is telling us that the expectation of base rates coming down in the short term is going away. So I think fewer cuts, longer to get base rates down. Just to remind ourselves, we're at 5% at the moment. There was an expectation we might get down to 3.5 quite quickly.
It's not happening.
Now the markets are probably saying it's going to be, we're going to be stuck in the 4 region. Almost certainly we will get a cut in the next couple of days. There's tomorrow.
We've got tomorrow.
So and almost certainly they'll cut in the US. So we're fully expecting base rates to come down in the next 48 hours on both sides of the Atlantic. But this sort of big, 8 cuts before Christmas or whatever was being forecast, those are getting pushed out. So what's that meant for us in terms of our fixed income markets? Well, the first thing is it's been really good that we haven't got into any long duration bonds, because as those yields go up, the bonds that are most affected are the longer duration bonds. So, for example, if you get a 1% increase in the yield on a 20-year bond, you're going to have roughly 20%
change,
knock off the value. So we don't own any 20-year bonds, thank goodness. So we are relatively impervious. We've seen it's fair to say we've seen our fixed income funds level off a bit. They were motoring in the last 24 months, but they've leveled off a little bit. But we would fully expect them to return to a sort of upward path in the next few weeks, basically, as rates settle down.
Very good. I mean, that was obviously the impact on
the UK budget.
Yeah. UK markets. We've seen gilt yields go up a little bit in the last few days, but over the last 2 or 3 months.
Yeah. And then in terms of the US election, well, maybe the way to just address that just as a starter was to sort of think about our macro advisors, TS Lombard. They came up with two effects. They thought that US treasuries would fall in value and yields would rise, and that has happened. And they also thought that a quick result would be positive for markets, which it has been, and that the recovery in the wider market rather than the Magnificent Seven and the Nasdaq would be bigger than in the Magnificent Seven. And that's also happened. I mean, I looked at my phone just before we started, and I think we're up about 3% in the Dow Jones at the moment, and only 2 and a bit % in the Nasdaq. So we have the big winners of the move today in America have been financials and cyclical companies rather than tech companies. Tech companies are up a bit. Tesla's up a lot because of the Musk, the bromance going on there between Musk and Trump. But things like Netflix was down, Meta was down. Quite a lot of the big tech companies that have been leading the way are flat or down today, whereas something like American Express is up strongly. JP Morgan was up 8 or 9%. Citibank was up. All the US big banks were up. The one thing TS Lombard got wrong was they thought we were going to have a Democratic president, but we've got a Republican president. We won't hold that against them, but it just shows you how much speculation there was and how little people knew about what the result was going to be. On this side of the Atlantic, I suspect people in America probably had an inkling that what was going to happen. And Ben knew exactly what was going to happen about a month out, called it absolutely square. And I'm surprised he's here today because all his bets paying off, but he is here today, which is great. But yeah, so Ben called it right from the early days that he would probably win.
But I guess the fear factor regarding an extended or prolonged decision.
I think that was what everybody was worrying about, that there'd be a challenge to the result, that we wouldn't find out for 3 or 4 weeks after the event. That's all gone out the window. Obviously, we've got a very strong mandate for who, and off he goes. Very
good. Focusing on fixed income just for a bit, James.
Yes.
The team's view on fixed income returns over the short to medium term, 2 to 5 years, discussed that a little bit, but what are the specific head and tailwinds concerning this asset class?
Well, we've still got 7 point something yields on our main corporate bond funds. And I was actually speaking to one of the bond fund managers today, and we still see really nice, strong above inflation returns on the corporate bond funds. 7%
Got
over
high
2 years
coupons.
is going to give us roughly 15%, whereas the 2-year gilt market is telling us that if you put your money on deposit, you might make 8% over the next 2 years. We think in the corporate bonds we're going to make 14, 15, 16% over the next 2 years. So we're still as positive as ever on our fixed income funds. I guess one of the threats has to be, which Ben picked up, was inflation. So I think there is a concern that Trump will be inflationary, and in the UK, and in the UK, a massive increase in salaries in the public sector is going to feed through into inflation. So I think we can fully expect inflation to be sticky going forwards.
Base rates will be sticky.
And base rates to be sticky. Yeah.
It says, is the bond market's reaction to the recent budget, we've discussed the increase in yields, a short-term response, or will the proposed debt levels and the gilt issuance volumes likely have a longer-term impact on the bond values? Crystal ball.
Yeah, so we thank you for sending these questions in advance, because it did allow us to discuss them, and some of them with Nick before he left. But I think on the levels of debt, we don't particularly have a strong view that that's going to play a role yet. Obviously, the level of government debt in both the US and the UK is pretty high now relative to GDP, but manageable, we think. And we're not getting anybody warning us that that's going to be a big issue. In fact, the sort of risks of recession seem to be off the table more than they have been historically. That probably means there's a recession hitting next week, but what we're being told is that the risk of recession is lower. So I think we're not expecting a big rate hike like we got in 2021, 22, which would cause a big loss in our bond funds. But now we're probably not also expecting a steep decline in base rates, which might have given us a capital gain in our fixed income funds, and then lower rates after it. We're now looking at probably clipping the coupons, as we call it, rather than expecting to get a lot of capital gain out of the funds. But clipping 7% a year is still not a bad return,
and continuing to enjoy positive real returns.
So again, we have to watch that inflation figure to see if it starts creeping up above 3%. If it's in the 2 to 3%, I suspect the governments won't do very much about it. If it starts going back over 3 or 4, we might get some rates rising again.
There's a question here. After today, in your opinion, what are the top 3 risks we're facing between now and say the next 1.5 years? We talked about inflation. You mentioned briefly possibility, although low possibility, of recession. I mean, that seems to be the main issue, geopolitical.
I think
that hasn't gone away.
There's probably two issues that come to mind. One is the geopolitical issue. Mr. Trump has said he will fix both wars very quickly, although he hasn't said how. So, the how there could be quite interesting. Let's see how he gets on. So that geopolitical risk is in the background, hasn't gone away, and trying to fix these things quickly in the short term perhaps carries higher risk than letting them linger and carry on. The other thing that we have to face up to is that equity markets have been rising and rising and rising, and they're just risen again. So today's action has pushed all the indices into new high positions. I think, Ben, I think it's fair to say we're on new year-to-date highs. So you'll be very pleased when you look at your portfolio values in the next 48 hours over the next 2 days, as those rises feed into the prices. You're going to start to see your funds pushing back to year-to-date highs again. But we just have to watch out for the end of the music stopping, as it were, because there's no doubt that this is like a cyclist having a can of Coke. Trump he's going to inject some short-term energy into the markets, and we're probably going to get a rise. But the fundamentals are still being stretched with each rise. And when you see Tesla going up 15%, you just have to think, not for me. Thank you very much.
We talked about inflation briefly as a result of fiscal expansion, but insofar as it's almost an impossible question for you, James. But first, the geopolitical risk is concerned. Continued discord in the Middle East and oil prices, is that potentially a factor in terms of inflation?
I think one, I don't really feel qualified to sort of talk about this. I heard one way he might try and fix the Russian crisis would be to flood the market with oil and bring the price of oil down. That would actually be deflationary rather than inflationary. So, Russia, its main export is oil and gas. If the price of those two things come down, that's probably going to hurt Putin more than other sanctions. So, we'll have to wait and see, is the answer to that one.
One here, it's a perennial question regarding the debt mountain.
Yes.
And relates to both the UK and the US, even before Trump's victory and possible fiscal expansion. Do we have any point of view first from T.S. Lombard?
Well, so the one thing that T.S. Lombard say to us most of the time is that both in the UK and the US, family balance sheets are actually quite strong, and the levels of personal debt have been declining rather than increasing. So the debt that we're seeing is in governments. It's treasury issue, it's gilt issue, and there is no doubt that both US treasuries and UK gilts, there's going to be a lot of issuance of those bonds going forward in order to fund those deficits and to fund the debt that's already exists. So T.S. Lombard were negative on longer dated US, well, they're negative on treasuries, full stop. We don't, we're not buying gilts and we're not buying US treasuries either. We think it's much better to have the higher returns coming in from the corporate bond market and keep the duration short in order to avoid any big capital loss if interest rates did rise. So, it is something that we're watching, and we're cautious of. But I think that the counter to the level of government debt is the fact that actually family balance sheets are pretty strong. And look even stronger when the index rises. I mean, T.S. Lombard are always telling us that unlike the UK market, which gets driven off mortgage interest rates, US consumers tend to run off their 401ks. So when their 401ks are going up, they're feeling more likely to spend money when their 401ks are falling. So a rising stock market is probably good for the economy in the US.
One question, we talked about the outcome of the election in terms of asset class performance. The view here is, can we expect an uptick in equities? I think we've talked a little bit about that in terms of question mark. The odds are, I think, in the short term because of Trump positive, but
like always, it's always interesting that the market's definitely been holding back in the last few weeks. I think it's fair to say, Ben, we've had a bit of volatility. You have to remember that we had a bout of some 20-odd% inflation that went through between 2021 and 2024. So, real prices aren't as scary as nominal prices when you look at them. And from a technical perspective, the action today definitely pushes the indices into what we call a technical breakout. So that there is quite a good chance, I think, of the rally continuing for the rest of the year now. But we've always got those prices in the background as well.
Very good. Another question. I think we've partly answered it, but the fact is, and you've mentioned the fact, in recent weeks we've seen a downturn in fund values. What are the reasons for this? And I guess this issue around US.
I think
bond yields going up.
The markets hate uncertainty, basically. So the uncertainty over the US election has undoubtedly put a lid on things for the last few weeks. There were scenarios that could have played out which looked pretty messy. As it's turned out, we've got a very clean result and the uncertainty has been removed, and that's probably the best thing that could have happened for Trump. For the markets, I mean, there was a big debate about whether Trump or Harris would be better for equities in the long term, and I think the debate's probably still out on that. But most people see Trump as being pro-business, pro-equity markets. So generally, the US market is off to the races again.
But tech has suffered, is that right, in the latest?
Well, tech is,
apart from Tesla, obviously.
I mean, we haven't got Nick in the room today, but this is where Nick has been positioned us very nicely in our portfolios is that, we had seen tech run up enormously on the back of AI to very high prices. There is this concern over whether that AI is going to be easy to monetize. Meta's spending a huge amount of money, I mean, billions of dollars on it, and yet it's not too clear how that increases their, ad revenues. So tech market has definitely been pushed, whereas other areas of the market which have been less well loved are rallying more strongly today, it seems. So financials, for example, which have been out of fashion, they're coming back strongly.
We've talked about the markets quite a bit. Moving on to the economy, what domestic and or US policy moves should we be looking for to see a return to on-target growth? I mean, it was interesting to see the forecasts coming out as a result of the budget for growth in the UK over the next few years. Actually, I felt quite subdued. But what policy moves should we be looking for in terms
Ben's
of...
looking at me, I'm looking at Ben.
Are we going to get much? I mean, I think your point about, is it a growth budget? It would be interesting to find out from our viewers. As
I mean, we could have run a poll on that, which would have been quite interesting. But I think the general consensus is probably not. I mean, I think we're, there's a lot of spending going on, but most of that spending is in the public sector. That tends to not necessarily filter through to growth. So I think it's hard to see. And then, I mean, we didn't really talk about it, but the load of tax raising has fallen quite squarely in companies, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're employing anybody in the UK, your cost base has just gone up significantly. And then we've got this I have my other hat on. So at the sailing club, we employ, 7 people under the age of 22. And our minimum wage costs just keep going up and up and up and up. Yeah. So the combination of the minimum wage and the national insurance increase is a huge pressure on small businesses and big businesses generally. And I think that's going to certainly take be a headwind for companies, listed on the UK that are operating in the UK. Obviously, there's some companies listed on the UK stock market that aren't operating more globally. We have got a poll. So thanks to our online assistant
support here,
Sarah has just produced the poll, which is fantastic, and I appear to be talking to the converted. We haven't got a single person who thinks it's a pro-growth budget, which is
doesn't say much for
I think
state
that's
allocation.
Right. Look, I think we have got somebody prepared to go yes. I mean, I think, look, what we found out with the budget was what a Labour government is going to look like and how it's going to behave. It shouldn't have been a big surprise.
It was relatively well taken. I mean, the market gilts weren't impressed. Obviously, currency was unmoved.
Yeah,
equities remained unloved in the UK.
That's we haven't talked about currencies, and that's an interesting point, which is to say that obviously today we've seen the dollar strengthen. That's not something that TS Lombard think is sustainable, because the big push here from Trump is about onshoring business activities into the US, and a strong dollar just makes that pushing water uphill the whole time, because obviously then they try and export, and the exchange rate makes the goods very expensive. So the general sense that we're getting is that over time the dollar probably won't be as strong as it has been historically, and that they will let the dollar slowly drift downwards. So that might be a headwind to our US equity investments.
I guess the interesting thing is, though, in terms of what we were anticipating that might have happened as a result of the budget and the elections, and how it could have impacted our investment strategy, it really hasn't had much of an effect overall.
Could have been worse.
I mean, we definitely had a policy decision at the investment committee to do nothing and stay in the market, stay fully invested. And today, I think we're up somewhere around 2% in the portfolios. It won't necessarily all appear tomorrow. It'll appear in the next couple of days, as the bond funds tend to be a bit slower. But speaking to the bond fund manager this morning, his fund was going more in line with equities than with interest rates. So in these credit funds, where there's corporate bonds, the view that companies are going to perform well and be strong is generally supportive of the bonds. So that's outweighed the interest rate movement in the short term. So I think we're going to see pretty much across the board our funds rising in the next couple of days. And then we'll have to see whether it's a sustained rally or whether we get some sort of setback. But certainly it bodes well for our 2024 figures, which are already looking good. So I think we're up sort of 8 to 9%. Maybe we handed back 1 and a bit percent we worked out, over the last couple of weeks as things in the run up to the elections. But that looks like that's all flowed back on again in the last, today.
And you alluded to it briefly, but the issue of small cap versus large cap, because that's obviously been a huge subject over the last couple of years with the Magnificent Seven, and it's been very difficult for active managers to beat the index when you've got 6 or 7 stocks driving the markets. Are you comfortable with our current position, both in terms of small cap versus large cap? And you mentioned that the recent impact actually has been positive.
Well, there you go.
From a relative allocation.
So just looking at the US markets today, the Dow Jones, as we speak, is up 3.5%. The NASDAQ is up 2.75%. The Russell 250, or 2000, is it the Russell? I always get this. 2000. Russell 2000 is up 5 and 3.
Wow.
0.35%.
Okay.
So
we stuck to our guns.
What's it called? Ben, can you remember the name of the small company's manager?
DeLon.
No. The one we hold, the Select Fund, not the Better World Fund, the one we changed to.
Oh, Montanaro.
The Montanaro Select Fund will be up
manager.
Probably 5 to 6% over the course of the week, I would wager, because that tends to react more to that Russell 2000 index than the other main indices. So, it is actually, he's not here in the room, but it is very much playing to Nick's positioning of the portfolios. We're getting a wider rally rather than the rally being entirely focused on these top big mega cap stocks. So it is playing very much into his book at the moment, as we say.
I don't want to sound too corny, but it's obvious that the US elections trump the UK budget in terms of the impact on the markets. And I think we've seen that, and this issue of the uncertainty disappearing has clearly had a huge impact. But also, as you say, the fact that Trump is perceived to be pro-business just generally. The inflation issues are in, who knows whether that'll actually turn out in due course. Trump is well known for saying lots in advance and perhaps not necessarily carrying those threats out. I just do wonder in terms of
I think we've always known that one of the way out of the debt mountain is to have inflation, sustained inflation for a little while. So, again, thinking in real terms, although in nominal terms, the level of debt has increased obviously over the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen a 20% hike in inflation. So in real terms, maybe the debt isn't been going up as quickly as we think. And I think, most governments around the world are going to be quite comfortable seeing inflation ticking along at 2 or 3%. Maybe if it starts heading up to 4, 5, 6, 7%, we'll see some action again. But I think we can fully expect inflation to be rolling along at a higher level than we were used to, in the.
We're not going back to the QE.
We're not going back
for sure.
to the days of.
Got an interesting market question in terms of Bitcoin. It's not something we are necessarily fans of, but nevertheless, thoughts regarding today's uptick for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's now reached record levels.
Well, let's put it
and
to
the impact of Trump's support for it. Yes,
the youngster on the panel. Do you want to say anything on that, Ben?
No comment on that. I have no idea about Bitcoin.
Look, I think the look at things that have really torn off today. So you've got Tesla going up by 15%. I haven't looked at it just to see where it is right now. Bitcoin, I think, was up 8% or something like that. Donald James Trump, DJT Technologies, was up 26% or whatever. I mean, these are just betting. Let's be quite blunt about this. There is no fundamental value to any of these instruments. They are just instruments that people around the world, mostly Americans, like to bet on. And so what we're seeing today is those speculative, things going up as you would kind of expect. And also there's a bit of speculation the other way. So TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductors is down, the Chinese equity market is down. So things that are likely to see Trump implied put tariffs on is being bet against, and stuff that we don't know anything about is going up through the roof, but we're not going anywhere near them.
Very
That's
good.
my view.
I think we've covered certainly all the questions that have come through, unless there are any other questions that you'd like to pose.
5 more minutes we have on the clock.
We have a
if
few more
anybody wants
minutes
to
if
ask us
anybody
a
wants to
question.
come through. Clearly, there was a lot of anticipation, as I said earlier, regarding both the budget and the
Could
elections.
you run a poll on annuities to see if anybody was thinking about buying an annuity?
Yeah, that's a good one. We're very curious to understand, is there a demand out there amongst our clients, at least, for annuities? In light
Sarah's
of
just
James has
typing away, and maybe we've just got time
James
to
has
see
said.
whether any of you had been thinking that you might annuitize your funds. Obviously, there's a conflict of interest, which we should disclose. We love you to keep your funds with us rather than buy annuities, but my paper will hopefully show you in due course that it's done from the heart, not just from the wallet. That advice that we generally do think that you'll get a better deal out of drawdown. Here we go. Exit poll. No one's thinking about buying annuities.
Not
Let's
yet.
see if anybody else is. I mean, it's quite interesting. We've had obviously really nice returns for a couple of years. Oh, there are a couple of people.
And you can diversify a little bit. You don't have to convert the whole pot.
There is that, but you know, we've got this dual account arrangement in the drawdowns now. So if you want to take advantage of the uptick in equities and take some profits in your SIP account, put them into a separate account so that you've effectively got secure money to draw on for the next 10 years or 15 years. You know, we've got the mechanism to do that now. So do bring that up with your advisor, and that I think is a much better mechanism and a much I mean, I'll give you one statistic which I found out doing this research on the annuities. So we've got average life expectancy, mean life expectancy, and modal life expectancy, which is when half the population that you're considering has died. And modal life expectancy for men is still under 80. So even though average life expectancy is 87, 50% of men will be dead by 80. And most annuities that you can buy in the current market won't give you a return if you die before 80. So you've got a 50% chance of making no money buying an annuity is broadly what that message is. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's, you know, a nice thing to end the talk on. Is so before you rush out and buy them, just think about.
Well, we're looking forward to getting your paper,
yes,
James. And in the meantime, it really just leaves me to thank everybody for attending. It has been a record attendance for us. This is the 4th webinar we've had this year, and it's certainly something we look forward to continuing in the future. So that really just leaves me to, as I said, well, thank you, James, and you, Ben, for your insights this evening. The recording will be provided to anyone who missed it this evening, or to anyone, in fact, who would like to listen to it again. We have one final question, which has absolutely nothing to do with the budget or the elections. What did James think of the America's Cup? For those of you, I'm sure you know, James is a keen sailor. Unfortunately, Ben Ainsley and the UK effort failed to bring back the America's Cup.
Ben's campaign was all over the shop until I went personally down and had a chat with him in Barcelona. And after that, he won about 3 or 4 matches straight.
You should have stayed out there.
I should have stayed out.
No, sorry.
It was fantastic. And we thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a shame that we couldn't do it, but that's the America's Cup. It's a heavily
it's a 2-horse race.
Well, no, it's worse than a 2. It's a what do they say about casino tables? It's tilted. It's very tilted to the defender.
The defenders, yeah. They get to choose the rules, right?
If anybody wants to take me out for supper and talk about the American Cup for an hour, I'd be delighted.
Excellent. Okay. Well, on that note, once again, thank you very much for attending tonight, and wish you all the best for the future. But good to know that, in particular, fixed income has positive real returns and looks like it will continue for some time to come. And the portfolios are remaining resilient. Many thanks once again. Bye for now.